Le damos unos saludos cálidos a los presentes y a los que se unen a nosotros a través de nuestra página de Facebook. En el día de hoy, la capacitación va a estar a cargo del National Alliance of Preservation Commissions, NAPC, son las siglas en inglés, y a cargo de ello va a estar la señora Stephanie Paul, que es la directora ejecutiva, Marie Snyder, Frederick Mittner, que es planificadora, Angela Shadell, and Melissa Wiley. I hope I haven't mispronounced your last names. Thank you very much for your support. Y entonces espero que todos disfruten de este adiestramiento. Y ahora los dejo con Frederick.
Thank you, Gloria, and thank you all for welcoming us to your beautiful island. We're really excited to present Camp Resilience here in Puerto Rico. CAMP stands for Commission Assistance Mentoring Program, and again, our focus is on resiliency. We're very appreciative of the National Park Service for funding this. And so first we'll just do a little intro of our camp trainers. Again, I'm Frederick Mittner. I am the preservation planner for the city of West Palm Beach in Florida. I'm also affiliated with the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation and have had my share of hurricanes as being a Florida native. So I'm very excited to be here with you. If we'll do a quick, I know they'll do a more in-depth introduction during their presentations, but if Angela and
Thank you for the introduction, Gloria, and thanks for having us here in Puerto Rico. I'm Dr. Angela Shadell. I was in the Navy for 25 years, and before that, I grew up in Tampa, Florida. So I grew up going through many hurricanes, but then also understanding the historic buildings that were at the University of Tampa and Tampa Theater. So I bring my engineering expertise to this group, and I'm so glad to be here.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us. My name is Melissa Wiley, and I'm the CEO and president of the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation. We're Florida's nonprofit that works throughout the state to protect our history and heritage. And I'm excited to talk to you guys today about communication and public engagement and survey work. So thank you.
This is going to be a great day. I know you have had those who have attended the last couple days, a lot of great presentations, but we also want to hear about you, and we want to hear what you would like to get out of camp today. So is there anyone brave enough to be the first one to share who they are, where they're from? This gentleman here, I think you were sharing earlier, you're from Ponce. I don't think we have a portable mic, so you can project or come up here, either one. You're certainly welcome to come up here, please.
Okay, my name is Jorge Ortiz Colon from the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture, and also on behalf of the Institute, which is also on the organizing group of this activity, and our director, Carlos Ruiz Cortez, we welcome every one of you here. I am a preservation architect in Ponce, which has been ravaged by both the hurricanes and earthquakes, and I hope to learn something about how to make more disaster-proof our delicate heritage, especially on outside San Juan, where we have many buildings of different materials like wood, rubber masonry, and brick, which are quite vulnerable to natural disasters. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And besides what we're going to share with you today, you have such a wealth of knowledge in the room and in your community. So it's great to network with each other. Is there anyone else who would like to introduce themselves or share what they would like to get out of camp today? Okay, if not, this is a very kind of informal setting. If throughout the presentations you have questions, please go ahead and chime in. I want to make sure that you all know that the training does qualify for continuing education credits. If you are an AIA member, please make sure you sign in. You do need to sign in at the If you have questions throughout the presentations, please do just raise your hand and let us know. Our agenda and our roadmap for today is just kind of this welcome introduction. Angela is going to do a disaster planning and recovery for historic communities, kind of an overview. Melissa is going to speak about public engagement in disaster adaptation and recovery. We'll have a brief break from 11 to 11:15. Then we, both Angela and Melissa will share about assessing through survey and documentation work for disasters. We'll have a lunch break from 12:15 to 1 o'clock. And then this afternoon, pre-disaster adaptation and post-disaster rehabilitation, as well as applying the design guidelines in your communities or the Secretary of Interior standards to that adaptation and recovery. And we'll wrap up by 3:15 this afternoon. So if, again, if you want to kind of plan your day accordingly, I'm sure many of you know, but the restroom is about 2 doors down from the outdoor hallway. There is a cafe downstairs. If you need any coffee, hopefully we're more exciting than that, but coffee and delicious treats downstairs. NAPC, that was introduced earlier by Gloria, stands for National Alliance of Preservation Commissions, NAPC. And NAPC's role is to educate, and help build strong local preservation programs, because preservation is really grassroots and at the local level, and so important to make sure your local community is engaged. Doing the education outreach is through, of course, camps like this. The National Alliance Review, which is NAPC's quarterly journal, has great articles. It is an electronic version. There is a great listserv called NAPCL, which is a discussion group, and it's a wonderful resource where if you have questions about a particular material or a building material, or perhaps a preservation initiative in your community, there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. Everyone around the country chimes in and gives you examples of their ordinances. Again, the training then through camp, commission assistance mentoring program, where we do presentations, hands-on exercises, group discussions. The networking is my favorite part, meeting people, you know, just around the corner that you didn't even realize were on the same mission as you, because I know preservation is such important work, but sometimes we do need those cheerleaders to remind us to keep going. It can be a long road. This special camp focus where we do resilience and disaster planning, because it is so critical for our cultural heritage to work on that. Trainings, there's also webinars that are live or on demand, and short courses over the summer, virtual short courses where they dig deep into specific topics like preservation justice and making sure your local government program is more equitable. Forum's NAPC, I'm a little extra excited this time to announce that Forum is our biennial conference, and next time it's going to be in West Palm Beach, Florida. I'm sure you know that there is in 2024, July 31st through August 4th, West Palm Beach, Florida. It's people come from all over to discuss preservation, great lectures, great tours. There are 4 JetBlue flights out of San Juan to Fort Lauderdale, a quick bright line ride up to West Palm, just 45 minutes. You can do it. We really hope you join us there. It's a really great educational and networking opportunity in 2024. And then advocacy, because certainly that's very important too. NAPC serves as your voice in DC for federal, state, and local levels of government, promoting policies and programs that are important for preservation. So there's also a newly adopted values and principles guide to help with decision making from a legislative standpoint. By being here today, you are going to get a complimentary 1-year membership to NAPC, and you have access to all these wonderful things, such as the Alliance Review, webinars, discounted rates to Forum, and the listserv. So we really hope you have you'll partake in this membership. So I will turn it over after wanting to welcome you. I will turn it over to Angela. And I'm sure you know what you're doing. I'm going to do stop here. I'm going to let you figure that out. Let me figure it out.
Well, good morning. I hope you all had your coffee this morning, but if not, I'll do my best to keep you awake. I think I said I was an officer in the Navy, but what I didn't tell you was I was a professor of engineering. So I'm used to having 60 students in a classroom. And if you look like you're falling asleep, I might, have you do something fun. At the Naval Academy, my students wore black uniforms and I had a white chalkboard. And there was a little bit of a threat that if you fell asleep in my class, there might be a chalk thrown at you or passed towards you, or the eraser was really good at waking someone up. And then the poor student would have a little bit of white on them. So I won't do that to you, but that was definitely my Navy training when I was a student. Do I need to share this or can you pass it over? Sorry, I don't see, I lost my ability to share. Or wait, sorry about the technical difficulties. I thought I was in there and then my ability to share disappeared. Man. Yeah, I think it's this one. But that's not PowerPoint. Let's see if this will do it. See? Lots of computers today. Let's see. There we go. And it won't go. There we go. All right, so that's me. As I said, I'm an engineer, so I'm the lone engineer in the room. I have been working community resilience for the last 5 years in Florida. That means I lead vulnerability assessments for coastal flooding and sea level rise. Prior to being in Florida in engineering, I was at the U.S. Naval Academy, where I worked on the Sea Level Rise Advisory Committee for the city of Annapolis. So I want to give you some context at what we're talking about with resilience. I updated these slides just this week with the most recent $2022 billion natural disasters. I think it's really important to point out that just last year alone, there were 18 separate billion-dollar natural disasters. That's the third most costly year since they started counting these in 1980. Since behind 2017 and then 2005. Obviously, you all are very familiar with what happened in 2017, unfortunately, and then 2005 is Katrina. I think a question I get asked very often when I go to communities is, why is it more expensive? Why are, if you look at this, the second bullet there, that we've had 341 total billion-dollar events from natural hazards since 1980. That exceed $2.4 trillion, but the total cost of the last 7 years exceeds exceeds the $1 trillion. So there's been a lot more in recent years. And I get asked, is this happening more frequently? I think the reason we're seeing more billion-dollar disasters, and this isn't really my opinion, there are a lot of studies on this, is because of more people are moving to the coast. The infrastructure happens to be more expensive at the coast. The property values are increasing. And there are more people in harm's way. So just like we saw in Florida with Hurricane Ian, and as we saw here in Maria and Irma, more dollar values of properties being exposed to natural hazards. In 2022, though, it's the 8th consecutive year where we've had 10 or more billion-dollar weather and climate disaster events. And I think this is an interesting picture here. So I can get my pointer going. Of the 3 states here that since 1980 have had the most billion-dollar cumulative weather events, you can see there Texas, Louisiana, and Florida. And I think the statistics on this is that Texas and Florida are very much more populous than Louisiana. So when you look at that, you can kind of think, wow, Louisiana has such a big burden. And you can see Puerto Rico is also in a darker red too. And you all having, fewer population than these states are carrying a lot of the burden, similar to California. I pulled from Puerto Rico. I know you all live here, so you've been very familiar with this, but since 1980, there have been 8 tropical cyclone events. There have been other natural disasters, but the tropical cyclones tend to be the most expensive on record of all the natural hazard disasters. And you can see I put them in order from most recent to on the bottom to the most far away since 1980, from Fiona just this past year, all the way down to Hugo. But you can see the dollar value change. And this is CPI adjusted consumer price index to 2022 dollars. And you can see the billions of dollars of expense. And obviously in 2017, the Irma and Maria were the most expensive. But I mean, you can go back to Hugo. If anyone here in the room remember Hugo? Yeah, I do. I lived in Florida at the time and I was remembering the devastation, but you can see just the devastation and how it was, much more relative to a Dorian or Fiona event. So the reason that we're here from camp, as Frederic mentioned, was it's a partnership with the National Park Service. We have modules where we've got 21 different advisors. I happen to be one of the advisors, as well as several of the trainers here, where we have people experienced in disaster planning that come and give these classes. You can see we've given them all over the United States. I think this is our first time outside the continental US, is that right, for NAPC? And it's hosted once again through NAPC, the National Park Service, and the local SHPOs. And you can see it's for Harvey, Irma, Maria, Florence, U2, or Michael disaster declared states. These are the things I'm going to cover today and that you'll hear us talk about throughout the today. Once again, I'm just doing the overview. So I'll cover a little bit of a highlight of each of these. So natural disasters, I know you're familiar with them, but I think some people in Florida just think hurricane or tropical cyclone, and we forget about things like geological. Obviously, you heard Jorge here talk about Ponce, and we know that Ponce was, very much affected in 2020 with the earthquakes that were there, and that's another thing that Puerto Rico has to worry about. Obviously, there's the weather events that could be a severe tornado or just a rainfall event, the hydrological, which could be just the coastal flooding, and then wildfire or fire events. One natural disaster that we hadn't really thought about that came up the last couple of years was biological, was the pandemic. That was something that was a natural event, a natural disaster that did cause significant economic effects throughout the continental United States and its territories, including Puerto Rico. And you see the effects of it with a lot of the vacancies here in Old San Juan and everywhere I've been in the past few years. So some terminology I'll use because I feel like some people use these terms in different ways. So with adaptation, to me, I think of adaptation as the way something is adjusting, whether it's ecological, social, or economic systems in response to something that happened. So an example for me is, once again, I'm from Florida. Mangroves, when I was a kid, only really existed in South Florida and the Florida Keys. But due to changing weather and changing water temperatures, mangroves have naturally adapted. They're an ecological system that now we're seeing mangroves in Jacksonville, Florida, which were not there 10, 15, 20 years ago. So adaptation, I think sometimes we think as humans, we have to build a bigger wall or we have to, to change our ways. But our ecological systems do that too. And the mangroves are just one example that that I'm very familiar with that does that. And what I like about mangroves is some studies I've seen that my friends are doing, other engineers, is mangroves not only are moving further north and to protect our coasts, but they're also migrating further inland as sea level rises. So mangroves have the ability to grow taller or higher and migrate inland, which I don't think we as humans are very good at migrating north or inland. I feel like everybody's migrating south and to the coast. So I feel like we're the opposite of mangroves in some ways. Resilience is a really interesting one. Resilience can be individual for me as a person. How quickly can I bounce back or recover from something if I'm sick, right? If I got COVID or I had a flu, how quickly does my body respond to that and do I recover? But when we talk about resilience in this context today for camp, we're really talking about an entire community. That's why my practice is what we call community resilience. How do you help an entire community to bounce back quicker and return to normalcy? In engineering terms, resilience is if I stretch something, a metal, if you stretch it and then you let it go back, it goes back to its original shape. But if you stretch it too much, eventually it breaks. So we want to be resilient. We want to bounce back and not break. And we want to return back better than we were before. Hazard mitigation is a way, mitigation, the word to me just means to reduce, to make something smaller. But you hear the word used interchangeably, mitigation with adaptation. So I just want to say that it's different. It's a reduction or a reduction, lowering of loss of life, personal injury, property damage. And you can see the different strategies there, which we'll talk about. But once again, I will use the word adaptation and mitigation together. And then recovery is obviously, as you all have been doing, we've been doing right now since the pandemic, but you've also been doing it since Fiona and the earthquakes. I feel like Puerto Rico has been in a constant state of recovery for the past 5 years. And I know you want to be to a place where everything's normal again, but I know you're resilient people because you've been here for many, many years. And I love coming back, and I have very many friends from Puerto Rico who are very resilient. Some other terms we're going to use is things like non-structural property protection. So as I talked about the mangroves, in my mind, something like a mangrove is a non-structural property protection. If you are planting mangroves, that's what we call a natural feature, a natural adaptation. That's a way to protect your property. Another way, though, that's non-structural could be something that is a change in policy. Maybe it's a change in policy of we're not going to allow people to build back there. So you're protecting properties by not having them being built or rebuilt in harm's way, which I think is a very hard thing. We'll talk about that more in one of my next discussions after lunch. Public education to me, and I know that Melissa will get into this because that's her area of expertise, is just informing citizens and elected officials, about these natural hazards and ways to reduce them. And we have a whole brief on that. Structural projects, that's one of my areas of expertise as an engineer, is, construction to reduce hazard impact. That's what Gloria said this building is undergoing here. They're reinforcing the tiles. You saw they were relaying the floor, but also adding the expansion joints in them so that the floor is able to expand and contract due to seismic activities or humidity. Sometimes, structural projects can be adding a flood wall or, building a dam or a levee or a retaining wall. And I'll show you some examples of those in my talk. And then there's this term staply here. And it's the initials that you see up here, staply: social, technical, administrative, political, legal, economic, and environmental. In the city of St. Augustine, I did a project 3 years ago where we looked at what is the staply, how does an adaptation project, when I am evaluating maybe 5 or 6, do I build a flood wall or do I elevate the building, and looking at it, how is it affected by these different things? And then the community value for a historic property is actually one of the most important, is what does the community feel about this historic property? How does it affect, what's its level of significance? How does it affect the economics locally? And so I think in talking about historic properties specifically, you have to understand the community sentiment as well as, the structural expertise. And there's a lot of things that come into perspective with historic properties. All right. So as a coastal engineer, I spent a lot of time doing flooding, and my company actually has done the studies for the flood insurance rate maps. You probably, hopefully know your flood insurance zone. I won't define all the terminology, but I do just want to clarify a few things. So a flood can be either a partial or a complete flood. Sometimes you hear the word inundation, and someone will ask me what's the difference between an inundation and a flood. There are different types of flooding. Inundation to me is something has standing water for a long period of time. So maybe after a hurricane, you might have a storm surge where the pressure of the hurricane is suctioning up the water and bringing it on land. When something is inundated, that means to me that it's got, several inches or feet of water that have remained there for several hours or maybe several days. Different types of floods in my mind are with a flash flood. You might have rainfall that just causes a flash flood. So you've got flash flooding, you have an inundation caused by storm surge. You might have riverine flooding where you've got rain that has come down a river and has overflowed the floodplain there. And typically those come inland. And then lately we're seeing what we call sunny day flooding or nuisance flooding or king tide flooding. I don't know. Do you have a term in Puerto Rico for nuisance flooding? I don't know if you call it anything different. And in Florida, it tends to be sunny day flooding or nuisance. And that's just tidal. That's just the result of sea level rise where we have a higher water level than we used to. And now we're seeing that tidal flooding is happening more often. And then a couple of FEMA terms, since the National Park Service is here today, and some of you are looking at maybe applying for FEMA grants, are the 1% annual chance flood, also known as the 100-year flood. It's just a 1% chance in any given year of flooding. The 100-year flood is probably the worst way to say it, because then people say, oh, I had my 100 year and I'm good for 100 years. That's not true. Although it was with the pandemic, since it's about 100 years between Spanish flu and the COVID pandemic, which is ironic to me. And then there's the 0.2% annual chance flood, which is what we call the 500-year flood. If you're in a FEMA floodplain, you know that you are required to have flood insurance if you're in the 100-year flood or the 1% annual chance zone. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't have flood insurance if you're outside of that. So that's what the 0.2% is. Just for context, I have friends that are in the Netherlands, and they actually plan for the 10,000-year flood. So if you can imagine, our planning is for the 100-year or the 500-year, we're looking at the 10,000-year. And to give you some peace of mind, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the United States protects all of their nuclear plants to the 10,000-year flood. My company has done some of those studies. So I'm familiar with knowing it was post-Fukushima in Japan and that earthquake. And after that, the meltdown there, the NRC hired coastal engineers to actually look at specific power plants and protect them to a much higher standard than we do other buildings. So if you're interested in protecting something to the 10,000 year, let me know. I know how to do those studies, but it takes a lot of time and expense if you want to protect something for that high, which the Dutch do. The term BFE you might hear a little bit, and you might be familiar with it. It's the base flood elevation. That happens to be where we think the flooding will occur during that 100-year storm. The BFE does include storm surge, as well as waves on top and what we call wave run up. So it's a little bit bigger than just a storm surge flood. And then the last thing there is what we call freeboard. Anybody a sailor? I grew up sailing. Anybody go on boats and know what freeboard means with the boat? No one wants to volunteer. Well, when you're sitting I was in the Navy. So when you're in a boat, the freeboard is the height from where the water level is into the deck of the boat. That's called freeboard. So freeboard, if you think about it with a building, is the same thing. It's the height above where that water level or that base flood elevation would be to the first floor of the building. In the United States, we typically have a building code rule that your building, if it's in the floodplain, the 100-year floodplain, or the 1% annual chance, has to be built at least 1 foot above the BFE. So you have to have 1 foot of freeboard. In some municipalities, it's 2 foot of freeboard, and every municipality can put in their own code. So just understanding that term freeboard. And I think if I'm in a canoe and it has no freeboard, I'm going to turn over if somebody moves. If I'm in a canoe with a lot of freeboard and somebody slides around, I'm not going to turn over. So freeboard to me, I have to think of in terms of boats because that's how I learned it as a child. So this term build back better comes from the Sendai framework, which is an international way of looking at specific, cultural heritage and historic buildings. And I think, the World Heritage Center put this out and talking about, disaster risk. But in thinking about the Sendai framework, it's important to understand the risk. So that's one thing, is understanding, where your historic properties and cultural resources are vulnerable. Then strengthening the disaster risk governance. So that is, looking at policy and making sure elected officials are understanding. We'll talk about this more. Getting a disaster relief plan, having disaster fed into your historic preservation master plan, which we did in Annapolis. We did a hazard mitigation plan for historic properties. And then, investing in that disaster risk reduction, that mitigation to make more resilient buildings. And the last one is the preparedness. And we'll talk about, looking at once you've had, number 3 is preparing for an event. Number 4 is after you've had an event, how you build back better and become more resilient. So there's a lot of different reports out there. You can see I pulled some of the ones from Puerto Rico, but in disaster planning and recovering, you look for all these different type of plans. So I'm going to start at, the national level and come down. So FEMA, or the Department of Homeland Security, has this national response framework that explains how they help. It explains, how a emergency management plan works. It also talks about what a hazard mitigation plan or an LMS or local mitigation strategy is. And FEMA has this framework that they have to follow in order to get you funds in order for a presidential disaster declaration. So if you ever get confused on are we in a presidential disaster declaration? How does this happen? What type of funding are we available for? The FEMA website has really good resources on this, and the National Response Framework. I think people think it's only for emergency managers. I think if you are doing any type of recovery in your community, you need to be familiar with the rules that are in there. A resilience plan is something that I recommend. I do a lot of resilience plans, adaptation, and climate action for communities in Florida. That's kind of my bread and butter. That's what I do most every day. There was a Puerto Rico resilience plan done here by University of Pennsylvania post Harvey. Post Irma and Maria, which is interesting. I found it online. If you want the link, I can share it with you afterwards. And then you can see there was also another study done on disaster recovery planning for Puerto Rico. Both of these have really good information. And then specific to historic properties is directly from the SHPO here in Puerto Rico. And then once there's done a resilience plan, I think looking at more master planning and vulnerability assessment for historic preservation. I think every community I meet with in Florida, I have their historic preservation officer come to the table when we do a vulnerability assessment. And I try to make sure that they're including historic properties in not only the local mitigation strategy, we call it the LMS in the United States, and you probably do here too. I know you have it for your municipalities, and also the SIP, or the capital improvement plan. And that's just saying, where are we going to put money in the future to help? What are we protecting? What are we improving? And I think having historic properties included isn't done in a lot of communities, so it's important to do. Here's an example of what we call an HMP, or a hazard mitigation plan, from Austin, Texas. And what they do is they have this historic preservation plan. It's overseen by the City of Austin's Historic Preservation Office. But you can see this quote here. is oftentimes when a historic preservation plan is done for in a city, they're just assessing the buildings and sites, but they're not thinking about the natural hazards that they're susceptible to. And in some ways, depending on where you are and the hazard, some historic properties do better than newer properties. It's possible that a building that was built, 300 years ago is still standing for a reason because it was built to be resilient because of the building materials. And we found that in Annapolis, buildings that were flooded during Tropical Storm Isabel that were historic tended to do better than newer buildings. Think about the materials and methods. If it's a plaster wall and wood floors, those can be dried out. Whereas if you just have, drywall and carpet, those don't do as well. So in becoming more resilient, sometimes our historic buildings are more, not always, but sometimes they are. This is an example of what I was mentioning in the city of Annapolis. This is some of our historic flooding. This is what it would look like when I would go downtown for coffee some mornings. I have a great picture, not in this slide, but there's a Starbucks over there just to the right of the red and white awning. And I have a picture of the barista actually carrying coffee to someone's car, wearing flood boots up to their knees, because the sunny day flooding we were having due to high tide, which still occurs probably, about 2 or 3 times a month in the city of Annapolis in this historic seaport. You have this flooding. This is not, these kids here at the statue are not supposed to be underwater. So because of that, and this was happening when I lived there 15 years ago, the city of Annapolis, decided that they wanted to promote mitigation for historic properties. So they wrote a cultural resource hazard mitigation plan where we were looking specifically at the different historic properties, and we branded it. My friend Lisa Craig, it's called Weather It Together. And I had an umbrella. I have an umbrella that says Weather It Together. And just having that brand and passing out those umbrellas and t-shirts that said Weather It Together and this place matters to the public in Annapolis really helped people think about. It was a great public information campaign of, okay, we're going to have flooding. I might have to wear my boots or my flip-flops when I go to Starbucks, but just understanding that we're all in this together, I think was really interesting. I talked a little bit about a resilience plan. This is an example of one that I led in Venice 2 years ago. And a resilience plan can be a lot of things. In this case, we did a vulnerability assessment. The city of Venice has many historic structures there. And we looked at how do we update the current land use codes and maybe look at maybe not having future land use in areas that are flooded. We looked at development standards. Maybe we tighten up the building code so that freeboard, instead of being, BFE plus 1 foot, is now BFE plus 2. We even talked about some incentive programs that if you are, we threw these around, they haven't been vetted completely yet by the elected officials, but I'm still talking with the city of Venice. I just had an email with them last night about coming to meet with them next week about how do you protect the historic properties that are there, and could you provide an incentive to historic property owners to do flood adaptation on their buildings to protect them? Is there like a property tax break you could give them? So we've been experimenting with different things to encourage protection of the cultural resources in the city. This is an example of what our vulnerability assessment looked like for the city of Venice for that resilience plan. So what you're seeing here is an area that has been flooded. This is the 2% annual chance swell. So once again, that's the 500 year, and the swell is a still water elevation plus sea level rise. So city of Venice, I've got historic buildings, happen to be these little red triangles. So you can see the red triangles, downtown area. And we were looking at, where did these, this is the their water treatment plant right there in the yellow dots. And the water treatment plant, they were holding up as, as important as an asset as the cultural heritage, because the cultural heritage brings the tourists into Venice. And once people want to live in an area that has some cultural heritage. So just getting them to, when we're identifying critical assets, having the city engineer say, hey, can you bring your historic preservation person in? And I think for all of you in the room, if you hear that a vulnerability assessment or a resilience plan is being done, you need to volunteer to sit on that steering committee. It is more time that you don't get paid extra overtime for, but I can say it's very informative to the utility city engineer to understand, what is at risk in the city and how that really helps with the economics. So then, in looking at the flooding there, and then we can provide recommendations as to how you would adapt it. This is the community values assessment. It's an example of one we did in Annapolis. And I said, this place matters. We had these signs that would say, this place matters to me. And we would have people go around the city and take a picture with them. And in this places matters campaign, it was a way to, once again, determine the public sentiment of cultural resources. And then the picture on the right is a design charrette that I led in the city of Punta Gorda, which also has some pretty cool historic resources. I mentioned a little bit about economic assessment. I think it's understanding the value of your community's heritage. And I know, here in Old San Juan, you can probably put a $sign on the value of the community's heritage in Old San Juan, right? The National Park Service, can tell you how many people come through the door every day because they have the ticket counts, which that's actually what we did in the Castillo de San Marcos and St. Augustine when I did this work here. The graphic on the left, what you're seeing is this is the attendance that was expected before Hurricane Irma at the national park. And we had ticket counts for like a 10-year period for daily. And when Hurricane Irma happened, that's what this little block is here. It was only over about a 3-day period. You can see this was the expected attendance, and the attendance really dropped. And it took about a month to 6 weeks for it to come back. And in determining the economic damages, we brought in a company that specializes in heritage economics, and they looked at what is at stake if the fort, if the Castillo de San Marcos and St. Augustine can't open for a month, or if the people can't get there because the streets are flooded. What does that do to the hotels and the restaurants and the horse-drawn carriages and the tour guides? And what we found, and once again, I didn't do the study, I led this team, but I had some heritage economists from Place Economics out of the University of Pennsylvania, and they determined that there was a $2.9 billion effect on that was the value of heritage in St. Augustine. And they said that 55% of the visitors that come to St. Augustine come for heritage tourism. We had much more than the numbers from the National Park Service, but keep in mind, an economic assessment can help you then apply for FEMA grant dollars, because you can say, this is the benefit cost. Benefit cost ratio is very important when you're looking for FEMA hazard mitigation funding. Some public education and engagement. I think public education tends to be maybe a negative term, because the public will tell you we don't need to be educated. We know all about this. We've been through every hurricane, right? So sometimes we like to say public engagement or stakeholder engagement, that, we are a stakeholder, you live here too, you care. And it's the key is not only, the educating, but it's engaging and empowering your community decision makers. It's bringing really important people to the table. This one I participated in the city of Jacksonville. On the left there, it was a beaches forum. We had mayors from our beaches cities along the Atlantic coast, from Jacksonville Beach, Atlantic Beach, Neptune Beach, really small municipalities, but they were heavily affected by Hurricane Irma. And so they came to the table with one of our local radio hosts. So WJCT is our NPR public radio and TV station. And we had a forum there. I think we had about 500 people in the room. They previewed the Sinking Cities Miami forum. And then I got to show some flood maps of city of Jacksonville, which, what does everyone do when they see a flood map? Where's my house and what's it going to look like with 2 feet of sea level rise? So I love going to public forum, and I am in there. I'm behind all the people. I felt like I was being inundated by people, but it was really fabulous to, it wasn't just property owners, it was business owners. The Chamber of Commerce was there, civic leaders. As I said, it's just really important to get great media in this. It made it to a podcast, a TV show. The public engagement is probably my favorite part. So here's where I have the outreach. When we did some work for Northeast Florida, we did this really neat survey, and it was a public engagement survey where we were asking people, hey, what do you think is most important to you, or what is the biggest threat to your city? And we gave them the choices of, hurricanes, sea level rise, aging infrastructure. I mean, that's not a natural hazard, but in Jacksonville or city of St. Augustine, or probably here in Puerto Rico, infrastructure tends to come up a lot. Flooding, water quality, city improvement. So we asked these questions, and the people could prioritize. And we had about, I think 250 people respond to this. So we got a really good data that I could take then to the mayors and the nonprofits and the trade groups, and go to any conference and say, hey, they're really concerned about the heritage preservation in the city of St. Augustine or within downtown Jacksonville, or these people are most concerned about water quality. It depends on where you are. The people are different. So I think a survey or something interactive, or just getting in a room and asking people and letting them have a voice sometimes is really a good way to get the word out. Sometimes the state level is a really good way to do a risk assessment. So the state of Florida recently funded a sea level impact projection study tool. I had I guess I had the honor of building this. So it's DEP contracted directly with my company, and we created essentially it's a statewide vulnerability assessment for any state funded construction on the coastal building zone. So if you go into the map tool, you can do a study to understand the vulnerability at a site. Having a hurricane preparation guide like Puerto Rico does here is also a nice state resource to make sure that that is given out. Federal, there are technical tools. I mentioned a little bit about FEMA. FEMA has lots of publications like this that can be used. They even have a great, National Park Service has a great one on disaster, which I know you'll probably cover. I saw this in someone else's slides earlier. And then there's a climate.gov. So I think in looking at disaster planning and recovery, we'll talk more about it, is, looking at the federal level, what's available, what is FEMA, National Park Service, EPA, what does your state historic preservation office have for you? We'll cover a lot of these different ones, but these are some of the experts that have technical tools, whether it's a website, someone on the phone that you can call, or if it's a document. And then we talked about federal funding, and I know any of you here attend yesterday's discussion with FEMA and National Park Service about how to apply for funds. Maybe somebody, hopefully someone online did. FEMA is always coming up with new things. This one on the left was just announced just last week. You can see it's a brand new, it's a safeguarding tomorrow revolving loan fund. So it's not a grant, but it is a revolving loan fund. You can see there's a historic preservation fund that's from National Park Service. I'm sure they talked about that yesterday. There's BRIC, which is the Building Resilience Infrastructure Communities, and I'll talk about that more in mine, but there's even Small Business Association, making sure, the Small Business Administration, gives small loans. And then to wrap up here, I won't touch too much on this because I know that Frederick's going to cover this, but the National Park Service does have, just published about a year and a half ago, these guidelines on flood adaptation for rehabilitating historic buildings. So it's a great resource for property owners to understand. And obviously you all want to know about it, but it defines, resilience of, once again, withstanding and recovering from a flood event. We'll cover some more materials and methods in future ones, but understanding, not only maintaining, but documenting the historic property and what's there. And this is some of the non-structural temporary protective members. I know everybody's familiar with the sandbags and Visqueen, but there are things that you can buy at Home Depot, like a floodgate that'll just protect your water from coming in your door. This is an example of one we did in City of St. Augustine, where you've got the Lombius House, one of the oldest buildings in the City of St. Augustine. And we walked around with an architect and a landscape architect and an archaeologist. And we came up with different ways to protect this, structural, non-structural, and natural. I think the thing I learned the most as an engineer is I said, oh, well, we could store water on site. And my archaeologist said, you cannot dig holes in this property, Angela, because there's a lot of archaeological resources that have never been unearthed. And that was, as an engineer, I'm thinking, no, we dig and we build a wall. And I was told no. So we built berms instead. So we haven't built this, but that was the design, was to add more trees and berms in this case. Building elevation tends to be controversial. I'll cover more of that in my talk later. And there are some local municipalities that have flood adaptation design guidelines. The one on the right in St. Augustine is brand new, and it's available on their website. I think in closing, disaster planning is essential for the whole community. The historic preservation community needs to understand what the community values are and what the sentiment is, and then use that knowledge in surveying the community and understanding, what resources are there and what they want to protect to really strengthen the social infrastructure, to make it a more resilient community on the whole, not just looking at one building or one structure, but looking at the entire community wide. Sometimes, it can be several big infrastructure projects that help protect the buildings that are within. I think too, when you do something like this with the whole community, you're empowering individuals to be more prepared. So do we want to do a group photo now? I know we had this on there. No, I think we should, because we have everybody here and there. Get them out of their chairs and wake them up a bit. This was something that Lisa had. Oh, optional group photo. Do you want to turn the lights and do a group photo up here? And I can put up a pretty background. Is that the best background? Yeah.
Want to come in here?
Which stuff?
Hold on 1 second. I'll share it with you. Yeah, we're gonna put it probably on our face. Or I can. Okay. Days. Yeah, everybody.
I think so. I'm just trying to find my presentation. Here, hold on, let me just open it here. And it's got my name on it, so I have to find it. All right, so are we gonna just go ahead and get started, or is there a break, or just?
There's a break after.
Okay, so just go ahead and.
I don't. I must have been left.
I love that idea, though.
Yeah. Usually like.
Oh, so just to confirm, I'm going. We're good to go. Okay. I'm going to start my timer so I don't talk for too long. I've got it ready to go. All right. Thank you. So good morning, everybody. We're going to start our second session here today. It's public engagement in disaster planning and recovery. Am I doing okay? Okay, is that better? Okay, thank you. So we're going to talk about public engagement in disaster planning and recovery. And I like what Angela said about public engagement being more than public education. It's about inspiring and empowering people in their communities to help do the work to protect and respond to disasters. So I am Melissa Wiley. I am the CEO and president of the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation. And I wanted to share with you just a little bit about my background. I'm from Florida. I was born in Clearwater, Florida. And here's some pictures of my hometown. There's a historic picture and then a picture of Clearwater Bay, which is a significant feature there that people love. And then the middle picture is my father's house that he grew up in. And I'm there on top of the boat. I'm the taller child, and my sister and cousin are there. And that was my first experience with historic preservation, really. I didn't know it at the time. I was pretty young then, but looking back, that is the first time I realized that our built spaces are a part of our stories and our shared stories. And that when we lose those places, we lose part of the story and a part of the way of telling those stories. The other picture is my dad and I there a few years ago at the house. And when my grandmother passed away, the house was sold. My grandfather sold the house and it was demolished. And so for our family, that became kind of another loss that we faced, and almost losing another family member. So I think looking back, that was my first time realizing the importance of built places. And I imagine probably all of you have similar places that have been associated with your family or the community that you're from, and you want to work just as hard, and the people in your community want to work just as hard to save those places as I would have liked to save mine. So I work at the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation. We're Florida's statewide nonprofit that works to protect our history and heritage. So as a nonprofit, we work very closely with our state historic preservation office, but we operate a little differently. We are not funded through federal funds. As a nonprofit, we work through donations and gifts and memberships. And this allows us a little more freedom to do advocacy work, including local, state, and federal advocacy with lawmakers to help advocate for preservation-friendly initiatives, funding, laws, things of this nature. So it's a good partnership to maybe think about for your communities as well, if you have a preservation nonprofit to partner with. So I wanted to thank everyone who took the pre-survey to tell me a little bit more about you and your experience. A key part of communication is knowing your audience and your stakeholders and where they're coming from so that you can meet them there. So about 50% of the folks who responded to our survey said they had maybe a little bit of a squishy understanding of historic preservation. They weren't 100% sure about what the term means. And I think that's probably fair. I think sometimes we aren't cognizant of the fact that there may be not a general understanding of what historic preservation itself means. But I think that we are all here because we want to preserve historic places that are important to us. And also, I think we probably all realize our role as stewards to protect a historic place during our time here on Earth. You know, we have kind of inherited them from the past, and we want to make sure that they are here to be inherited by the future. And that is probably a shared sentiment that we all have. So if you want to think about the definition of historic preservation, here's one. I made it up, so I'm biased, but historic preservation helps preserve the memories of those who came before us, not just the memories of those who owned and lived in historic places, but of a community itself, the people who designed and built it, and the memory of what may have happened in that space. So I think with historic preservation, we don't just save a building to have a building stand there. We want to save buildings to be parts of communities, healthy communities, engage places like main streets, like the historic old San Juan here, places where people thrive and we can tell all of their stories, not just the story of a building. So also in that pre-survey that we did, you all shared some historic places that were important to you. So this is the Casa Yulanga and Asiobo. I'm sorry about the pronunciation, but it was built in 1850 and it was included on the survey. So I wanted to share this image of an important place for you all. I would love to go there one day. So here are the 4 key things that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about ways to engage with communities when planning for a disaster, how to engage with communities after a disaster, planning and determining stakeholders, which is really important for both of those, and communication tools to assist in disaster planning and recovery. And this is the Castillo Labadee in Mocha, which was another place that you shared in your survey that was important to you. So it was really enjoyable for me to be able to see some of these places that matter to you. So thank you so much for sharing those. So connecting with your community. Community outreach and public engagement. You guys probably already know this, but there are activities that you do to create engagement within your community around disaster planning and recovery specifically. So this should include several different modes of communication, from in-person events to meetings, online interactions, social media, surveys, public meetings. All of these can be tools that you engage with, but a key thing that you want to keep in mind is meeting people where they are. Sometimes it's challenging to just hold community meetings in your public buildings and not necessarily go out in the communities. And so I would encourage you to keep that as part of your toolkit, as to going out in the community and meeting people where they are. So we're going to think about 2 different kinds of communication in our public engagement here. There's disaster risk planning. So these would be risk assessments and surveys that you would do before a disaster strikes. Determining community values, you want to do that on the front end. Creating relationships with your key stakeholders, that we would like to do before a disaster happens, and then creating your plans and tools. Those are planning. And then, of course, you have your disaster response communication. So that's where you would implement some of the plans that you have come up with. You would do disaster assessments to go out into communities and determine impact. And we'll talk about that more in, I think, the after lunch session. You will implement your disaster communication plans. You will tell the story of what happened and share that with other stakeholders, and then advocate for funding policy changes, how to move forward to have recovery from this disaster happen, but also improved situations for the next disaster, which of course we hope there wouldn't be. So here's how this disaster risk communication process works. You identify a hazard, you assess risk, develop the policies, implement the policies, but it's a circle. It's always happening. And we're always improving. So the quote here is from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and it just highlights that risk communication aims to provide the public with information about the effects of an event, and then you use that to drive your planning and for future plans. And of course, focusing on this is not just a one-way flow of information, but it should be an interactive flow from the bottom up as well. So now we're going to go into some disaster risk terms. I don't know if you can, yeah, you can read those, okay? This is from the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction. So these slides will be sent out if you want to take a little time to study them. But I'm not going to read them, but you can dive a little deeper into disaster risk, public awareness, recovery, resilience. And these are keywords that are often utilized when thinking through public engagement. Some more terminology. Angela mentioned the base flood, sometimes the 1% annual chance flood or the 100-year flood, flood insurance rate maps, flood proofing, freeboard. We talked about that as well. All these are terms that it's important to kind of have a working knowledge of and be able to communicate and understand. So now that we've talked about our terms, we can think a little bit about communication planning itself. This is the same process for your front-end communications and then your post-disaster communications. You want to think through and determine what your key messages are. Gather your partners. That is a really key point in communications. It's much easier and much stronger to have collaboration with other entities as you're communicating, so you're working in sync to a broader audience. Then you determine your audiences. Again, meet them where they are. Make your plan. Identify the tools and the platforms that you're going to need to get those out. Then actually do the plan. Determine results. That's a huge part of planning. And then share them. And that is where, when we have found at the Florida Trust, we can help with post-disaster communications at the federal level, at the state level, because we have the ability to get into the communities, gather the data, gather pictures, and then share it with others. So there is a real quantifiable story to tell to different stakeholders like lawmakers, and they will help fund. They will help make laws that change different reactions that you may have going forwards. So sharing those results are key. When you're determining your stakeholder audience, and then we'll go through a couple specific examples of what those audiences might look like, but you want to include and inform and inspire the whole community, as we were talking about earlier. So that means agency staff and elected officials, and we'll talk a lot more about elected officials in a second. Other heritage preservation organizations like nonprofits, spiritual leaders in your community. They are wonderful people to get into the process and to talk through this. Often they are in historic buildings, so they are wonderful to have involved. Neighborhood groups, community groups, environmental groups, trade groups, businesses. For us, we work a lot with the Florida Main Street program and with the business owners in Main Streets. They are great to engage with. Historic property owners and other vulnerable residents. So the picture here is in Apalachicola in Florida. And it was a community meeting to talk about the risk of rising water in Apalachicola, which is in the Panhandle. It's on the Gulf, and it's also where a river comes in. So there's a lot of water rolling through this community. It is an oyster community. They did for many years, that was sort of the basis of their economy. But they're having to be on a hiatus for a few years now. But they wanted to talk about a map, as Angela was talking about, of potential risk for their community and the historic resources that would be impacted through that. And they talked about the values of the community, which historic place in their community would be the most important if they had to prioritize for them to protect. So this is an example of a stakeholder engagement tool that happened. And the other is Weather It Together in Annapolis, which is, as Angela mentioned, a really important conference that goes and shares these things. So through that process, hopefully you have done some work to identify who your stakeholders are, the people that you need to engage with in order to make your plan work. I just shared an example here of a stakeholder analysis that I did for a separate event, but it's the same, you can use the same model for anything. So you're looking at your left at the stakeholder group, and then you want to think about how important that group is to your outcome. So high, medium, low. And this will help you to rank the communications that you do and the audiences that you engage with. And then you want to think through, if I do a good job of engaging with these stakeholders, what will happen? What is the outcome that will happen? And then you can think through the tools, because you will have different tools to reach different stakeholders. Reaching a local elected official may require a meeting, whereas meeting a community neighbor, homeowner, you can maybe do that on social media. So there's different platforms and tools that you could use, and you want to think through all of that. So who do you want to engage with? How important are they? If you communicate well, what will happen? And what tools do you need? So here is one potential stakeholder group that you will certainly need to think through for your plan, and that is homeowners. So I would think that they were high in our plan that we did. We considered them high. And what did they need to know? Well, they needed to know what risk area they were in, how to protect their home, steps to take before a storm. These were the things that we wanted them to know. If that worked, here was the outcomes we hope to accomplish. The homeowner is safer, they're better prepared, their property is better protected. And the platforms and tools that we selected for them was public meetings, online resources such as social media, and public workshops. So you want to think through that for all of your stakeholders. And that stakeholder piece was a point on the pre-survey that was raised as a potential challenge, was identifying your stakeholders. So hopefully this will be a little helpful. Another stakeholder group that you're all going to work with is local elected officials. They and other public leaders are ideally positioned on the topic of community preparedness for disasters. They're an influencer of direct action, so we would rank them as a high on the stakeholder analysis. They influence and connect direct action, so you're going to want to include them. They can help get the message out, they can build partnerships, they can help engage with the media, they can get funding, they can make resilience a priority for your community. So there are three key ways in which local public officials make a difference in resiliency planning. They can engage, empower, and enact. So support your leaders to become engaged, work with them to influence, inform, and empower their constituents, and then encourage them to take action. We talk a lot about elected officials. I must have thought they were very, very, very important at the time. So planning for a better prepared, more disaster resilient community results in saving lives, which is the most important thing. And I should have started with that. When you're thinking through your plan, that should obviously be your number one key thing. Reduce the loss from a disaster, protect property, reduce the cost for flood insurance, which is a huge issue right now in Florida, and I'm sure it impacts y'all as well. Educate and prepare the community. And then I thought this was a really important piece of data. For every dollar invested in disaster mitigation, you save $6. And that's through the Pew Charitable Trust Natural Hazard Mitigation Survey. Other stakeholders that it's important for us to think through is the media. They can absolutely help you share notice that there are public meetings happening, share the initiatives, share the plans, with all of our stakeholder groups, it's really helpful to work on building relationships. That's true with media, with community organizations, and with other affinity groups that may share some of your values. So when you're thinking about building your relationships, this is a picture of the Florida Trust when we do our state advocacy every year. We're meeting with a lawmaker here from Jacksonville. Obviously, Jacksonville, as you mentioned, has some issues. And so we're talking through many things, including resiliency here. But it's just nice to have these conversations on the front end, keep them going, know who you can connect and who you can rely on as a partner, find out what they know, maybe fill some gaps with information where they may need to learn a little more, begin with the basics. So I was going to walk through kind of a case study of some disaster communications after disasters happened, and then we'll flip and kind of go in the reverse order and talk about planning communications. So Hurricane Ian came and hit Florida in October, and this map shows the impacted area of the state. So you can see this is quite a lot of the state. This is where my house was that I grew up in, that I shared the picture. And then this is where my mother lives. So all places that I love are here in the red part of this map. So as this hit, we have a hurricane response committee, and our work is to go out into the communities that are impacted and assess the damage to those historic buildings, the historic communities, the resources. So our key messages were the first thing we wanted to think through. And our first one was stay safe. People are the most important thing. So when we're doing our assessments, keep that top of mind and make sure that's top of mind when you're considering the people who have been impacted in this space. We had teams that were volunteering throughout the state in a coordinated effort. So we needed to make sure that they knew, and we had a shared platform for uploading our assessments when we were done and communicating with each other. So we had to make sure all of those were set up and ready to go. And we wanted to help tell the story of the impact of this storm for a variety of audiences, including our state legislature and our federal representatives, so we could hopefully impact funding in the recovery efforts from this space. A huge amount of Florida was obviously impacted by the storm. And by comparison, I'm also going to talk about the impact of Hurricane Michael, which was in the Panhandle. I live in Tallahassee now, so I'm up here in one of those red places. You can see the scope of those storms are very different. So for our response, we focused on collaboration since it was such a wide swath of Florida that we were working with. And we came up with a group that represented many different organizations. So we had the Florida Trust, our nonprofit, involved. We worked with the Division of Historical Resources, our SHPO's office. We worked with the Seminole Tribe of Florida, their TIPO's office, the Florida Public Archaeology Network, and the Florida Main Street program to all work together to determine the impact of the storm in communities throughout the state, and also to provide a report to share that story. And this is just another example of a tool that we use to kind of connect all those together. So a big part of that work that we started with, we knew we were going to have to utilize volunteers. It was too much space for our professional staff to go out and manage on their own to do the surveys and the assessments. So we partnered with FPAN, who has a great program they do that engages and enables what they call it citizen scientists to get out and to do assessments. So we offered this training for all of our volunteers who wanted to be a part of it. And we learned safe ways to get out in the field and gather that information. We focused on National Register and National Register eligible resources, and we also focused on the top 4 most impacted stories, counties where the eye of the storm kind of came in, the places where we knew the impact was potentially going to be the greatest. So if you've seen photos of Fort Myers, that's in Lee County, that was included. Charlotte County, where my mom lives, Port Charlotte, that was included. Our 4 hardest hit is where we started with this. And then through the Heritage Monitoring Scouts program, we talked about safely and ethically monitoring these sites and being sensitive to the fact that people had lost a lot. And we needed to be sensitive to that when we got into the community. Then we created that localized database, so we had a place to share our information and work together to create and share the outcomes of this, as I mentioned, especially with our lawmakers. So this is what we saw when we got out into the community. There were areas of pretty terrible impact, and there were places that were very resilient. I don't know if you can see in the picture here, but that's like a cell phone tower that fell down. That's in Boca Grande, which is in Lee County. It's a barrier island off of Fort Myers-ish, Port Charlotte. This down here is DeSoto County. That's Arcadia. The Opera House there was very deeply impacted, and that is in a Main Street program. So we shared that information with our Main Street partners. The Boca Grande Lighthouse was doing pretty well. There was another lighthouse that lost one of its 3 legs. And my favorite here is this is a fishing camp in Port Charlotte, which we're very interested in. And the history of Florida fishing camps were very important. And we had to go out by boat to see this and make sure that those resources were doing well. And we saw this beautiful rainbow on the way out there, which was really lovely. But what we determined through getting into the community, and I think this is a really awesome part about community and public engagement, we had volunteers that came out and they wanted to help do their resources, see what was going on. And so we split them up and gave them a couple, we gave them their National Register little information kit and all of the stuff. And they were, oh, I didn't know that used to be a 5 and dime, or, oh, I didn't know this. And they were so excited to learn more about the community they lived in, which was great. That's public engagement doing really good things. But also we learned as we went out into this community that some things that were listed and included in the National Register no longer exist. So we had an opportunity to update the National Register after that. And also we have a Florida master site file, which is a repository for historic resources in Florida. I know Puerto Rico has an inventory very similar. So we were able to update the Florida master site file, or in some cases find where there may be gaps in the Florida master site file and fill out those forms. So it's almost sort of a silver lining to these disaster events, is that you do have an opportunity to get into these communities and learn more and advocate for preservation and awareness and share their history and then go forward to help protect it. So when you think about best practices for disaster risk communication, here's sort of 7 things. Have an informed plan, know what you want to achieve and how you will achieve it. We've talked about that a little bit. Speak to the interests of the people and the communities, not always just yours. I know we wouldn't do that, but sometimes others might. Connect emotionally with these communities' values and their concerns, because this is a very emotional time. Obviously, I know we all know that in this room. Explain the risk, be clear and relevant to your audiences by using stories and visuals to make it personal. And then offer opportunities for reducing risk and facilitate a conversation that identifies actions appropriate for the community. Work with trusted sources, partner with multiple trusted community resources. I very much advocate for this to verify disaster risk and appropriate actions. And then not so much with post-disaster, but pre-disaster, a great best practice is to test the message, see how it resonates with folks, identify again with your target audiences and work with them to see if these messages are hitting home and engaging with them. And then finally, use multiple ways to communicate, multiple platforms. Of course, you can go back to your stakeholder plan and see what those platforms and tools were that you identified and work through those. Oh, I'm using like the computer. I could be using the clicker this whole time. I'm so sorry. Disaster risk and communication tools and techniques. So we talked about already the importance of having a plan, establishing a clear goal and understanding your audience. This is a little bit of a review, speaking to their interests, explaining the risks, offering options, if applicable, depending on where you are in the communication process, and partnering with trusted sources. So here are some examples of these communications working. You have a message, it's concise, you are repeating your main points, you're giving action steps and positives, and maybe action steps in 3s or 4s. Don't overwhelm people with too much information. Respect people's fears and perceptions, give people options. Avoid humor. This is from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, but I've heard this presentation given before, and sometimes a little humor does help kind of break up the bad news piece. So maybe sometimes avoid humor, sometimes don't. And then here are 10 steps to prepare for disaster recovery. Creating a disaster preparedness plan for your home or property, checking your insurance coverage. These are all things that we can communicate with our communities about how to move forward. Calling in your insurance company. These are the pre-disaster communications you can focus on. And they're very helpful. So you may wonder, where in this process do we engage the public in disaster resilience planning? And the answer is at the beginning of the process to inform the public of your plan and their efforts and to hear what they have to say. And then we will talk later about risk assessments, and we will talk through the communications of that. So I'm not going to go into that too much. When developing your goals, discuss mitigating actions, and then when you implement the plan, obviously inform the public of where you are in that process and steps going forward. So a part of this is working with the public to determine what historic places are important. And this should rely, a lot of times I am in Tallahassee in Florida, and it's a big state. And so we work very proactively to hear from others throughout the state about what historic places are important to them. So it is not me telling them the places in their community that are important. It is actively working to hear from them and listen to hear the places that are important to them, and then build communication strategies and preservation strategies around that. So if residents are invited to participate in these processes, I think it's important to hear the community values. So this is St. Augustine, the Castillo de San Marcos, which Angela mentioned, which looks very familiar to those of you here I've noticed in walking around. So in St. Augustine, the question was asked, which property resource would the community miss most? And then you can think through, as Angela was saying, economic value, maybe infrastructure. But then there's also the cultural connection, the importance, and the public sentiment around it. Places matter, sometimes independent from the economic value of that place as a driver. So has anybody been to St. Augustine? Yeah, well, I know you have. In the back. It is a lovely place, a lovely historic resource for Florida and the United States. So here are the places that the community said were the most significant for them. And the first was the Castillo de San Marcos, which makes sense. Flagler College, which was historically the Hotel Ponce de Leon. I should have put more pictures on here so you guys could see all of the beautiful history here. But they are actually ranked. So that kind of almost helps to set your priorities as you think through your plans and your assessments. So once you have done your community engagement, you have your communication plan, just a reminder to think through of your goals, which are broad, your objectives, which are specific and measurable, and then the actions and the tactics that you're going to implement to accomplish those things. And then you determine the who, what, when, where. We're about to get into some case studies that will help to go over these in a little more detail. Communication and disaster preparedness toolkits can be an outcome from this process. Here's a few examples that we've shared here that can help guide you. So we'll share these and you can look them up, and we have the URL for those. Angela shared a version of this slide, but they are technical tools that you can use when thinking through your plan and your planning and your engagement efforts. So FEMA, state emergency management agencies, local emergency management agencies, the National Park Service. Most of these, if not all of them, I think, are available online. So when we share these presentations, we can also share those URLs. Angela and I have a presentation that we do later that has some resources as well, but they're a great place to begin and sort of have lessons learned from other communication projects. So Historic Annapolis Adaption Approach for Sands House is a case study for a disaster emergency management plan. It was a free online program to help museums and cultural institutions write their own disaster plans. It offered guided planning for risk assessments. And this process is something that I think we can all kind of utilize for our own spaces. And I know it's something that our organization is going to work through this year on our own. And it focuses obviously on vulnerable properties. Here's another best practice from Florida. This is Weather It Together. That we had a conversation. Well, actually, it says Annapolis, but we did one just like it in St. Augustine, and we talked about the risk associated with, for St. Augustine specifically, rising water, and it included town hall meetings, conducting meeting interviews, road shows. It was a very extensive communication process. Oh, here's my other pictures. So you can see sort of examples of how extensive that was and the ways that we got into the community, or where the group got in the community to discuss these, including elementary schools, mayors, the Secretary of State, and all the participants in the conference. This is my daughter. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. She's 11, and I brought her with me to do our disaster assessments when we went to Port Charlotte, where my mom lives. So she's got her little form in her hand there, because while it is nice to have online forms, it also is a good idea to have them printed out, because oftentimes in disaster situations, you want to have a hard copy. The people in my office kind of joke around with me because they're younger than I am, and they have everything online, and I'm always going to have to need to have my little printout here. But it was a wonderful educational opportunity for her to get out and to see and to think through historic preservation and assessments. And it does help to build public awareness. And then here's the picture of St. Augustine, or excuse me, Apalachicola again. So when you do public sentiment, some ways that we've talked through: online survey, written questionnaires, workshop polling, a visual definition survey. The picture here is Keeping History Above Water. This is a workshop that the Florida Trust did in conjunction with the UF and Flagler College and the city of St. Augustine several years ago. But the focus here was around historic preservation, building codes, and resiliency, because that was identified through our work as an area that there was a need for additional communication, was specifically around building codes. So this workshop we did it in St. Augustine, we did it in Pensacola, we did it in Sarasota, Florida, and they all have a little bit of a different story, a little bit of a different risk, and their building codes were different. So it was a great opportunity to get and partner with all of these different collaborators in these communities and talk about their specific issues with resiliency in their building codes, and maybe some gaps and solutions for going forward. And charrettes were listed as another way to get out there and to envision the future of communities post sea level rise. And this is an example of a charrette that we do at our conference, Preservation on Main Street Conference, and thinking through and designing and imagining different alternatives. These are two architects here talking, so you can imagine they're having a great conversation. So here are the case studies that we're going to go through real quick. We're going to hit on Annapolis, Charleston, Nantucket, St. Augustine, the state of Oregon, and Newport. And these are just some examples of other communities and the work that they have done and sort of the output that came from that work that we can learn from. So here is Annapolis. They worked to, well, you kind of went over Annapolis already. So we've learned about that. We're going to fast forward. Now we're going to talk about Charleston, South Carolina, and they worked, the Historic Charleston Foundation and the City of Charleston launched Dutch Dialogues Charleston, a collaborative effort bringing together national and international water experts working alongside Charleston's local teams to conceptualize a living with water future. This new way of thinking about water, land, and people with multiple benefits will provide near and long-term value to Charleston, which is a coastal, obviously, city. They have sunny day flooding, rising water is an everyday reality for folks in Charleston. Nantucket, Massachusetts, I believe this was 2019, the Keeping History Above Water focus. They had a resilient Nantucket flooding adaptation and building elevation design guidelines that they had coming out of that public engagement work. Then St. Augustine, Florida has an award-winning plan from the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation. And Angela mentioned this as well, but it looks at resilient heritage and ways that they can face rising waters in the city with the knowledge of how important it is for their economic base, cultural tourism, and the cultural value for the whole United States. Then there was a communication toolkit case study from the state of Oregon, which looked at some different disasters than we've talked about so far. And it is a work in progress that helps deal with preparation and response to fire, flooding, tornadoes. It's a great communication case study. So if you want to look that one up, you can get the full reports. And finally, we have a adaptation partnership education case study from Newport, Rhode Island, also associated with keeping history above water, that addresses future flooding of the Point neighborhood, which is one of the oldest colonial districts in the United States. So very key, obviously, to protect there. And here's some more information about that work. They developed innovative approaches to addressing future flooding, the Point neighborhood, one of the oldest districts. And you can see here they showed how that might impact and what that would look like. Finally, we have Newport, Rhode Island School of Design worked to do a public engagement piece that talked about disaster planning and how that was essential for the whole community. Those were case studies. I know I went over them very quickly, so I apologize for that, but we can send that out in the presentations that we send out with all of our resources. This is the Museo Antigua in Oreo, which was another place that was included in the survey of cultural places, historic places in Puerto Rico that were important to you. We talked about today ways to engage with communities when planning for disasters, how to engage with communities after disaster, how to plan and determine and engage with stakeholders, and then communication tools to assist in disaster planning and recovery. And I wanted to just open it up now to any questions that you might have about disaster communications, recovery communications, stakeholder analysis, anything at all that you might want to know just a little bit more about. I know we kind of went through this quickly, but I'm happy to answer, or stories you might want to share. Anybody have anything? No? Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for the technical magic that is happening to enable all of this to happen. It is very impressive and we appreciate it. We're going to talk now about disaster risk assessment, survey, and documentation. So a little bit of a deeper dive on some of those things that Angela and I talked about earlier today. And so appropriately, we're going to split this up, and she and I are both going to be talking. So you've already met Angela and you've already met me, but I'm Melissa. Angela, do you want to come up here and talk about you real quick? Yeah, you do.
So I didn't have this in my first presentation because Melissa was like, hey, I need some pictures about you. And I thought, I don't even know where to start. I think what you see in this is I love to cook. I love to adventure. I love to be outdoors. I love to travel and go to other countries. And that pretty much sums it up. Like I said, I grew up in Tampa, Florida, but I was in the Navy for 25 years where I was a search and rescue helicopter pilot. So I've done disaster relief and humanitarian assistance on the military side. So I really understand what it looks like from DHS and DOD. But yeah, I love traveling and it's really great to be here in Puerto Rico with y'all.
And now I'm going to fast forward to mine. And then we don't like to compare really, but my life as told in pictures is a little less exciting than Angela's. I realize I have 3 cemeteries in mine, and that probably not as exciting as a helicopter or scuba diving, but I'm very passionate about preserving historic cemeteries. I think that cemeteries are sort of outdoor museums that tell the true story of places and people who have come before us. So that's a historic cemetery in Jacksonville. Frederick and I actually worked on to help clean up. I present at the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation where I work, and advocacy I talked about earlier, but that is a picture of me and some folks from Miami advocating for permanent appropriations for the National Park Service, and they own a lot of historic buildings, so we absolutely wanted to advocate for that. I love horses, and that's me and my daughter again. She's still cute, riding a horse. So we're trying to do a heart with our hands, but I'm not sure we were successful. And then I'm very lucky to get to do for a living something that I love, and I would probably, don't tell Frederick, but I probably do and have done for free. I love historic places and working to save them. So that's pretty much me. So here's what we're going to talk about today in this session. What are historic resource and disaster risk assessment surveys? Like, what are we talking about? Why should we do them? What is the benefits of these assessments and surveys? How to do them, the basics, and then how we can get funding to get surveys done, while also thinking about how surveys can actually impact funding themselves, because we always know that that funding piece is important. So I'm going to get started talking about the basic of historic resource surveys. And pretty much the premise here is, if you don't know that there is a historic place or a resource in your community, you can't work to protect it. You can't plan to protect it in case of a disaster. You can't be sure that it is included in a historic district or available for a historic overlay. You can't incorporate that resource in maybe potential development that might be going on in your community. And maybe it's not going to be listed in your national register district because you don't know it exists. So this is a picture of Ruben Acosta. He's with the Florida Division of Historical Resources. In Florida, we were in Newport Richey, which is another community not far from Tampa on the Gulf Coast. They have this beautiful historic main street, but none of it existed on the Florida master site file, which I mentioned before. Y'all have a similar inventory, but it's our record of historic places. And that is not good for a number of reasons, as we just talked about it, and you can probably imagine. So part of our community engagement there was to get out, get some volunteers together, and actually do a survey for each of the historic resources that were in that main street. So it is now included in the Florida master site file. And so for future researchers or developers who may come in, all of that information is collected. And there's also snapshots of what those buildings look like during that time. So in the future, 100 years from now, if you want to do a comparison, you'll be able to do that. So what are historic surveys? Surveys is the process of identifying and gathering data on a community's historic resources. It includes planning, organizing, and then supporting the development of inventories. The National Register Bulletin 24 outlines a survey's role in identifying properties that contribute to the community's character and provide information about the community's past. This is available online. If you wanted to do a deeper dive into it, you certainly could. But overall, surveys can help prioritize conservation, restoration, and rehabilitation, and identify those properties that could benefit from legal and financial tools for preservation. And finally, they can allow for government agencies to meet their regulatory requirements under existing law. So if you wanted to kind of think of it as a process flow, how all of this works together towards the accomplishment of historic preservation, you can think of it as a survey leads to a master plan, which can impact zoning, which can then impact design guidelines. And then when you take it to the next level, when you think of the Florida Master Site File, for instance, you have that knowledge that is available for others to learn about that building over time. So we already talked a little bit about community outreach and survey work. So this is maybe just a little bit of a refresher, but just again, doing survey work is a great way to get out in the community and communicate in a positive way about what historic preservation means. Again, we learned before that the words historic preservation don't always resonate with folks. So when you're out in your community, you're doing your volunteer survey work and you're meeting with people, it's an opportunity to meet them where they are, use their language, and most importantly, listen to what they say is important, and take note of that, incorporate it. So we're going to talk about two big sort of buckets of types of survey work. The first is the reconnaissance survey, or once over lightly field inspection to categorize resources, or it could be an archival literature review of the resources in the area. And something that we do a lot at the Florida Trust are these windshield surveys. So when a hurricane comes in, for instance, we have our committee go out and they get into the space. They're not doing intensive surveys. They're just looking at maybe, for instance, a main street and how that impact visually has been. And it can represent and show different architectural styles, periods, and modes of construction. This could also include a walkover survey of archaeological sites and inspections. Impact from storms could be gauged through this work. You can study aerial photographs, maps, plans, surveys, soil surveys, information to gain a general understanding of a community's development. And it could also be a detailed inspection of sample blocks or areas. So this is a picture of, again, Hurricane Michael's impact on the Big Bend area. And we're going to do like a little bit of a deeper dive here, just as an example of the importance of survey work. But overall, determine the time and resources needed to complete the survey dependent on the kind of survey that you're going to do, its complexity, and who is going to be conducting that survey. So is it going to be staff, consultants, volunteers? For the example that I'm going to share, it was very heavy on volunteers, but we just worked actually yesterday in a community outside of Miami, Florida called Opelika. It's a really cool community. It has, I think, the largest collection of Moorish revival architecture in North America for sure. And it is a historic main street as well, and it had a lack of survey work to document these structures, which are really amazing. So it was listed on our Florida's 11 to Save, which is another public engagement tool that we utilize. We have the community share with us places that matter to them, and then we share those places through our platforms in our audiences more broadly. And through that work, we were able to partner with the University of Florida and some students there in their preservation program. And they actually went and had a little bit of a field trip to Opelika. And they have now, because it was just yesterday, but I believe that through that work, they were able to get all of the historic main streets surveyed. So they were able to use a blend of professional staff, expertise of the students and the teachers from the University of Florida, volunteers, and the Main Street community. So another good example of how collaboration can help with your public engagement and your survey work. So we're going to talk a little bit about, I don't know, has anybody been to the Big Bend area of Florida? This piece right here. I know Frederick and Angela have, but yeah. So this is very different than most people's idea of what Florida is. I think a lot of folks, when they think of Florida, well, I know this because they've told me, you think of Disney World or beaches or Miami, and that does exist in Florida. But up here, this is a much more rural area. It has a very different history and architectural and historic fabric than other places in Florida. So we just kind of keep that in mind when we're talking through these stories. And I've circled a county here. It's called Calhoun County. And it's an example we're just going to talk through here when we talk about surveys. So Hurricane Michael came through in 2018, and our Hurricane Response Committee decided to go into those areas that were impacted by the storm and do windshield surveys of all of those counties. And we were going to use a guide similar to how we did with Hurricane Ian that I talked about before. We were going to use as a guide all of the resources that were on the National Register. And you can see this is an image from the Florida Master Site File that includes all of the National Register locations. So we are in a county, a relatively large county, and you can see there are three things listed here. The first is an archaeological site. So our Florida Master Site File doesn't include addresses for that to protect the resource. And then there's two buildings. Now, Calhoun County has more than two historical buildings, but this was all we had on the survey. So when we went out to do windshield inspection surveys, we saw there were historic homes, there were historic schools, there were historic cemeteries, which you know would matter very, very much to me, historic businesses of many types, but none of them were on the National Register. So we identified really a gap in our survey work there. And again, this is important because if the Division of Historical Resources wants to go out and do a check on all of the National Register resources in a county that's been impacted by a hurricane, and there's only two, then you're missing out a large swath of historic places that aren't going to be represented and potentially impact funds. Yes. No, you're good. How long do I have to wait for?
And survey recognition. I need to wait 2 years, 5 years to make another survey for updating survey.
Oh, updating best practices for updating surveys. For these surveys, they're kind of done as needed. I don't know if there is a best practice. Is it 10 years? 10 years. Yeah. 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 No, thank you. Appreciate it. Please do ask questions as we go along.
The significance, for example, that we talked about Just take, for example, national register, for example, state, local, and even community register can be important for the people that are close to the historic.
Yes, thank you. The question was talking about the different registers that exist. So we have a national register, and then some states have, like, our Florida Master Site File is another register, and then many cities have their own local landmarks or listing of historic places. That varies. I don't believe that Calhoun County had any local landmarks registered. And so I'm not sure about Calhoun County for sure. I don't know if that helps. So those are all reconnaissance surveys. Those are wind chill surveys. Those are things that you can do kind of quickly in a responsive kind of way if you needed to. Another type of survey are intensive surveys. They provide a precise record of property types, boundaries of the area. They're, as you would imagine, more intensive surveys that share the appearance and significance and integrity and boundaries of each property or region. So here is an example of one. This is Annapolis, and you can see here on the legend, they have in green the National Historic Landmark District, and yellow is the National Register District, and then in red is the Annapolis Historic District. So perhaps going to your point about the different registers and the different surveys. So they wanted to take into account all of these different pieces when they adapt the framework for their survey. So they looked at those boundaries, they looked at architectural surveys and physical features. Political elements were certainly taken into account, the residents affected, and all of this was driven through public meetings, historic surveys, other resources. And a key point was that they were able to justify the boundaries. They had meaningful, thoughtful conversations about where those boundaries of the survey were going to exist. And they had it in a sort of way that it could be referenced if there was a question about why was my house not included or why was my church not included. They were able to define how all those things came about. So now we're going to talk about some of the basic of historic risk assessments. And this is a picture from the survey work that we did after Hurricane Ian. This is in Lee County, Boca Grande. It is the Gasparilla Inn, and you can see that they are doing some mitigation work here to address the issues of the storm. It was pretty dramatic looking. And then I just shared a picture of what it looked like on a normal day here, so you could get a feel for that. So assessing natural hazard risk in the United States, there's a national risk index, which is wonderful. It catalogs the vulnerabilities for 18 different types of natural disasters and ranks communities across the country. It's a wonderful tool. But as John Ketchum from FEMA did say, wouldn't it be great if cultural resources were also included in a risk index, which is certainly true. So hazard mitigation planning. The importance of integrating historic property and cultural resource considerations into mitigation planning has been made very clear in the recent years. And we've had earthquakes, fires, floods, hurricanes, you name it. Unfortunately, we've had to experience that in the United States. So whether a disaster impacts a major community museum, a main street, a collection of family photographs, or home, cultural institutions, they all impact a community's character and economy and can affect the overall ability of the community to recover from a disaster event. So this publication, the Integrating Historic Property and Cultural Resource Considerations into Hazard Mitigation Planning, it is a great resource to think through planning all those things. And these 4 key points here: organizing efforts, identifying hazards, set mitigation priorities, and then to implement a plan. So survey is essential in the process of disaster preparation and recovery. Like we kind of talked about at the beginning, if you don't know that there is a historic resource, you can't work to protect it. You can't plan for disasters, unfortunately, and the mitigation of those issues. So we've kind of already talked about this a little bit, but just to stress, survey work can build public engagement, public awareness, and set priorities. And then we like this picture here of examples of how flooding can really impact your community, or any disaster can impact your community. Stressing that public engagement is important. So we're sharing this picture again. I love it, obviously, of Apalachicola disaster assessment survey work and public outreach. Effective methods for soliciting public sentiment. You want to cross a variety of platforms and use different communication methods. Your assessment of public sentiment should be based on actual input from the public, something I talked about earlier, getting your communications from the ground up instead of us telling you what's important. And then you want to think through all of your stakeholders for public sentiment, whether you just want to use people who live there, or in the case of St. Augustine, do you want to include perhaps your tourists, your visitors? In Florida, we have a lot of snowbirds, which are people that just come down for the South. Maybe we want to include their thoughts as well. So that work that was done, Angela was a big part of this. In St. Augustine, we actually came up with a list of the most important places we talked about a little bit before, but we were able to quantify the value of historic resources there. And we were also able to quantify their economic impact on the city. We talked about this a little bit already, I'm sorry, but other tools to get out there and talk about disaster assessment survey work are workshops that you can host in your community. You can collaborate with others to make that happen. And then I'm using the example here of our Preservation on Main Street conference. Disaster planning, resiliency, and recovery is always a key theme in our conferences, and we offer these for Main Streeters and preservationists around the state. That is in DeLand at Stetson University. Yeah, it was a beautiful venue. No, I don't, but it's old. So actually, you're next, Angela. And I'll just sit right here.
I love music, so I was looking at her organ and wondering what age is that? So we covered a lot of these definitions before in my overview. One thing I want to talk about is benefit cost analysis. You know, I mentioned that in my earlier presentation, but that the term BCA or benefit cost analysis is one where you're comparing the projected benefits of an adaptation alternative, or what they call a mitigation in FEMA terms, to, you know, what it costs. And I think projected benefits for cultural heritage is something that's really hard to wrap our arms around. So as we discussed, and as I discussed earlier, that those economic assessments are really important in hazard mitigation in order to get FEMA grant funding or any type of federal funding. So that's kind of a key point in hazard mitigation protection. I think, let's see, I've covered most of these. I think the last one at the bottom is probably the only one I haven't really defined. So SFHA, or what we call special flood hazard area, is that definition of what the FEMA hazards are. So you probably know it as, I'm in a flood zone, or I have to have flood insurance. That's kind of how we colloquially will say it. But in the engineering world, we say, are you in a flood hazard area, or are you in an SFHA? And I don't know why, but being military and engineer, we use a lot of acronyms. So if you're at the table as a historic preservation officer with your city's engineer, emergency management, and they're just throwing acronyms out there because engineers do that, and military and FEMA does that, or National Park Service, please don't be afraid to raise your hand and ask to define those. I don't know how many times I've been in meetings where I feel like I'm the only one that says, can you explain that term, or can you define that acronym? And I found sometimes the presenters don't know what the acronym is, and I'm like, wait, I can just Google it. But I just think it's really important that sometimes we use jargon that is not accessible to the community. And I guess historic preservationists probably use jargon that I don't know as an engineer. So I think that's one thing when it comes to terminology, just to make sure everyone's defining something the same way or understanding what's being said, because I find it very, very often. And I think, you know, another term under special flood hazard is people will say, well, I'm in a VE zone. VE is a flood hazard zone. The V stands for velocity. VE are coastal areas. That's where you have the velocity of the waves coming over the shore. So I would look at, you know, the El Morro historic site, especially Paseo del Morro. That's within a VE zone, right? It's getting waves. It's going to have wave overtopping on it that's causing wave impacting damage. An AE zone is the zone that's just inside. Both of them are still within the floodplain. They are still special flood hazard areas. They are still the 100-year flood zone. They just have different terms by FEMA. And that in FEMA terms is how high the water is going to be. So you'll hear terms thrown around sometimes by engineers like me, VE, AE, AO. they mean special flood hazard area. I feel like sometimes we're not accessible to the public when we use these different terms. All right, so I want to talk about a different type of survey than Melissa did. So you probably experienced this in Hurricane Maria or Irma, or maybe Fiona. I experienced it with Hurricane both Ian and Nicole this past year. FEMA will send out mitigation assessment teams. They're not necessarily looking at historic properties. They're looking at every property that was damaged. And they're bringing in experts. They're bringing in licensed professional engineers like myself. They're bringing in people in building sciences, maybe a contractor who does construction work in the area. They might bring someone from the insurance industry that understands what they're looking at, that kind of helps them with insurance rates. But by bringing together this collaborative where, kind of like she was talking about with the surveys, where you have FEMA staff, you have consultants that are being hired by FEMA with these experts, and some volunteers in the community, what you're doing is you're looking at how can we better inform building codes in the future? How can we make advancements in engineering? And even FEMA uses it to look at, hey, we spent money to do a mitigation project in the past. We gave them a grant. How did that perform? And so it's a really fascinating thing to me. And I think the timeline on the bottom, I know it's small. It just shows that over the last 30 years, FEMA has been drawing on these combined federal, state, and local resources of what we call a MAT, or mitigation assessment team. One of my good friends at my company was in Fort Myers just last week, all week, he was on a mitigation assessment team. So you can imagine Hurricane Ian happened in September? And here it is in January that they're there. So it's not an emergent, they're going to go out immediately after. We said before with a survey, the most important thing is, life and safety of people. So typically when you're doing a damage assessment survey, depending on the type, it might happen, 3 to 5 days afterwards. I think with the historic ones you were doing just recently, you said just yesterday. So here we are after Ian or Nicole and you're just doing them. So it's, sometimes you're getting there immediately. Those to me are for the public safety and health and welfare as engineers. We're looking, is this building going to fall down and hurt people? Whereas a mitigation assessment team is going out to see what happened to the infrastructure and what can we learn from it that helps inform future decisions. For every MAT team, which these come out of any type of presidential disaster declaration, you can see this is the report. I pulled off the FEMA website from Hurricanes Irma and Maria. You can see this date is actually October of 2018, but if you see it says, 2020 to it, it actually took them a couple years to get the report done. So it doesn't happen right away. But what they're doing is they're sending all these people that I said out to look at, once again, public safety being most important. They're looking at things like public shelters, hospitals, the police and fire stations, evacuation routes, public buildings. But it's really them doing very detailed reports on very specific buildings and getting feedback of the community, like, hey, were you here? What happened? Do you have photos? And sometimes you'll be asked as a community to provide photos. I think the historic preservation community needs to know if FEMA is coming in with a MAT and you hear that, you need to say, hey, can you look at our historic building? And I think your voice has to be heard because often they don't ask you, you have to insert yourself in the process. So having been on the other side, I know that sometimes you get forgotten, which you shouldn't be. So this is what it looks like. This is a structural damage evaluation that was done in Mexico Beach post-Michael. So I didn't know you were going to talk about Michael, but there we go. We're going to do Michael. They were taking pictures and you can see how they rank the buildings here. They can rank the one on the left as it's destroyed. The one here is it's severely damaged. And the two on the right, they're calling them moderate and minor. So what they do is they have very specific, we're engineers, we like specific definitions and terms, and they'll give, these terms. And then when they send the teams out, they want to make sure it's all standardized. And then when the survey goes, they have a website, an app. And they actually are just, either with their smartphone, or if they don't have good eyesight like me and have to wear glasses, they've got their iPad because it's much bigger and they can make the text bigger. And within that, they're taking, an overhead view. These are actually pictures from the Bahamas, from an island where I have a second home. And you can see that, these are the color codes depend on how high the damage was, pink being more severe and yellow being less severe. I think they use like a red to green. Green was okay, kind of that moderate or minor. The yellow was, in the middle, and the pink or red was more severe. And what they're doing is they want to make sure that, if you're sending 100 people out to do these, we're getting the same information back. So they say this is the person who's investigating it. You have to write your name on there so they can come back and ask questions, the date you're there taking the pictures. And then you take all the photos and you use the photos to assess and say, like, this is what I think, it's severely damaged. And we think this is the type of damage that was caused, whether it's, wind, hail, tornado. These are some of the photos that they take. They're actually doing engineering survey. So when Melissa started and said, we're going to talk about surveys, and I thought, used to teach surveys at that Naval Academy for my students. We would go out with the rod and the transit, now it's all digitized, but when I was first teaching about 15 years ago, we would go out with, the old school rod and transit, and the students are looking through and they're measuring different elevations. Elevations are important, if you can imagine, they're looking at, no waves, where that storm surge came to, where the water level was inside a structure or where it was outside. You can see, we call this the rack line, or where the debris was. They're looking at that because why do you think FEMA cares? FEMA has those flood insurance rate maps. They actually want to validate them, right? They want to see how good are flood insurance rate map studies compared to what actually happened. So that's one thing I like about FEMA is they're hiring the consultants, like my company is one of many, that did all the engineering modeling for these. They're actually having them go out in the field and say, you did this study, how did it turn out? How did it validate? Was the water higher or lower than you expected in this 100-year return period storm, or the 1%? So you should feel good about FEMA actually taking the people who do the engineering and just sit behind the computer all day to go out and do the surveys and really understand and see what's going on in the community. All right, now I'm going to switch away from my engineering hat of surveying and now talk about, survey and risk assessment. So this is city of Annapolis. This is where I had lived for 15 years before I moved back to my hometown of Florida. And you can see in, 10 years ago, so in 2013, NOAA said that Annapolis had the greatest increase in that nuisance or the sunny day or that high tide flooding. Remember how I said it was happening, at least once a month? Look at, in 1963, we were having 4 days of high tide flooding a year. By 2013, when I was teaching and living there, we were at 40 days. That seems like a lot when you're barista, at Starbucks. I keep using that example, but I've seen it. It's ingrained in my head is, you can't get to your coffee place. But then you look at 2018, we were already at 52 days, and they're saying by 2065 daily. I know it was at 60 days just a couple years ago. So it's definitely going up exponentially, and it does affect how people drive to work. I don't know if anyone here experiences that high tide flooding, but I had a friend who lived in downtown Annapolis, right around the corner of where, like 2 blocks from where the center picture was. And he's a firefighter, and he is a firefighter in DC. So he drives about an hour to work, and he came out one day and his car kind of smelled funny. And when he put his feet in, his floor mats were squishy. So he had high tide. There had not been a storm. It wasn't raining, but he had the high tide had come up over his floor mats in his truck, and then had come down and receded during the night. So when he got up the next morning to commute to work, his truck was flooded. And I remember him telling me the story, and I thought, here's someone who doesn't make a lot of money, who's doing a public service, whose truck just got completely wiped out, and he had no idea because he was asleep. It just happened during a high tide event. So things like that are more common occurrences these days, and we have to think about how they affect not only day-to-day citizens, but also our historic properties, and think about, flood mitigation in those. And in survey, you almost have to keep in mind, okay, there was a storm surge thing, but in looking at surveying, what are the vulnerabilities that exist there? And I think that's one of the keys is understanding, as I said before, this is city of Annapolis. Let's see, my friend's house, who I was just saying his truck got flooded. Where am I? All right, so this is the Naval Academy. This is where I worked for many years and went to school. He lived right in here. So right on the street. So you can see this is what we call the 100-year flood plus sea level rise. And it's equals an 8.2 design flood elevation or base flood elevation. So sometimes it's scary to show the public this, but sometimes if you've done a survey and you can say, like, these are where all the historic properties are that are flooded, it's really important to get that public outreach out. This is a photo on the left of downtown Annapolis in 2003. We had Hurricane Isabel, and I think there hadn't been a storm prior that reached that level in over 100 years. So it was just one of those shocks to the system that, people were kayaking downtown. You can see the blue kayak with someone's got their kid, they're pulling along, probably because the water was over their kid's head. But the elevation of flooding there was about 7.9 feet. And we had $125 million worth of damage at the Naval Academy. So I spent a lot of my time at the Naval Academy trying to figure out how to prepare for the next storm, which was depressing, but also good. I learned a lot about adaptation in the process. This is just identifying properties that are at risk with different feats. I know you really can't read what's over there, but it's got the addresses of the historic properties in red that were identified on the community values survey for Annapolis and Weather It Together as like very important to the community and at risk, and how do we help identify them. And what was interesting is when we were identifying these at-risk things, what we did is we actually went out in the community in Annapolis And we had this cultural resource inventory. I know it's kind of hard to read, but it was determining the community value for historic properties. This is that community values assessment I talked about before. So in survey, it's not only where they're located and what is their current status, it's looking at what would happen, what's the vulnerability of the property, you know, high, medium, low, the loss of the structure and the contents, if you can, you know, put a dollar value on that. What is that community values assessment? What places matter most, like we keep showing that. But within this worksheet, this is, you know, as Melissa said, it's really good to have things electronically, but it's also really nice to have paper, especially when you're, you know, the power goes out or you're out in the field. I know my sister-in-law lives in Fort Myers, and immediately after Dorian, she didn't have internet for about a month because she came to my house and said, I mean, you guys know this, you didn't have power here for what, 3 months, probably after Irma and Maria, at least. I mean, at least 3 months about. I know it was worse. And I was going to say that. I meant San Juan was 3 months, but like 6 months probably in Ponce and stuff. So, you know, you've lived with this. So consider if you're planning and you know you're going to go out and do some cultural risk assessments for disaster risk, you should probably have papers printed in advance, because you're not going to be able to print these and hand these out if you have no power, and you're not going to have internet to be able to access those. So it's, I think, planning ahead in some ways, while it is depressing. I mean, having you all have experienced it, you have a great lessons learned for communities. Have a whole bunch of papers ready to go that you can hand out to the volunteers that are meeting you. But this worksheet here has the name and address of the resource that they're going out to assess, the date it was constructed, so they know how old it is. If it's had any renovation, sometimes they put the date of renovation in there also. The type of property, its square footage, the structural system. To me, that's, you know, is it built with poured concrete or up on CMU masonry blocks, or is it slab, or is it, you know, built on wood? The primary materials that go into its construction, its function currently, is it being used or not? Is it functional? Its current condition. And I think the last one's important. Is the owner interested in mitigation? So if you're doing a pre-survey and you're trying to get these in there, it's really good to talk to that residence owner or the commercial property owner, if it's not owned by, you know, the public, and say, what is your interest in mitigation? And then, you know, that starts a conversation into showing them where they can get funding for that. So this is what it looks like when it's filled out. So this is I showed you we had it on paper, but then they had internet and they went and they were able to type in, and you can see we even included pictures in there. So if you're like, I'm not sure what the Dock Street Stevens Hardware is, which is one of the most notable features in downtown Annapolis, but they've got a photo with it, and they have all the stuff in there. This one had the conditions. I didn't say if the owner was interested in mitigation. I left that off as to, you know, no names will be used in this. And this is, once again, that community values assessment and just understanding the level of the property's value to vulnerability. You know, is it a high, medium, low in assessing the vulnerability? And this kind of shows a further on worksheet that talks about the loss of function costs, so that you can actually go to, you know, what would be the approximate loss in economic dollars. So that helps with the benefit cost analysis if you're doing mitigation. So in doing this with the survey, what we found is we actually were able to go. So this is a little more specific of a survey, but we went to the community businesses, and we actually asked the business owners to open their books and show us how much money they lost during Hurricane Isabel, and just had a general idea of, okay, you were closed for 30 days, but really people didn't start coming back to visit for 90 days, and your employees were still recovering. I mean, there's just a huge economic impact to the community in something like this. So it's really good to understand this. This is a flood hazard matrix that is showing the first floor elevation. And I think, you know, as an engineer, I'm always looking at data and numbers. But these right here, these two numbers are the most important when I do any vulnerability assessment, is understanding where the first floor elevation is. So I call it the FFE, or the finished first floor elevation. And then also the lowest opening elevation, because it could be that your first floor is here, but I have an opening lower. Maybe I have stairs that come up to it. I usually also ask for a term called lowest adjacent grade when I'm doing a survey, LAG. And in that, I'm looking at where does the land come up to. And sometimes it's because their air conditioner unit, instead of being elevated like it should, is maybe sitting on the ground or that lowest adjacent grade. So just some of that data helps you understand in a vulnerability assessment. Well, if the water is 6 inches, is it going to affect my mechanical, my plumbing, or is water going to, you know, back up through the sewer system into it if I don't have a backflow preventer? Is it going to affect my air conditioner? And then at what point does it come in the building? All right, so I'm going to close up here with some really cool survey tools. My friend Lisa Craig recently did a study in New Bern, North Carolina, which is a historic African-American community. and they had a heritage trail there. And they went in and they determined that there were a lot of missing properties on not only the national registries, but also the state and local. So they did windshield surveys, exactly like Melissa was showing. They went and they drove around and they gave people a little thing on an app on their phone, and they went and said, here's a picture, here's where it's located, here's the date I took it. And then they were able to go back and do some reconnaissance and figure out what year it was built and kind of, assess, the structure's value to the community. Another way of thinking about, doing a survey is flood elevations. That's one I was talking about where you're looking at, lowest adjacent grade and first floor opening. But are you familiar with L certificates? We call them, or elevation certificates. Typically a public building will have an elevation certificate. I know in the state of Florida, these elevation certificates are actually available online. You can type in Florida elevation certificate, and anyone that's been filed publicly with the Department of Emergency Management in Florida, which is required for all emergency shelters and city or county owned buildings and hospitals, those are all publicly available. I didn't know that until recently. I thought I always had to call the city and say, hey, give me all of your elevation certificates. But what I've noticed, and I'm sure Puerto Rico has a similar thing, is that these elevation certificates are required by FEMA to be on record if you are asking for flood insurance for a public building. So these flood elevation certificates, especially if it's a building that is used pretty often, that's in a special flood hazard area, it's required for new buildings, and then ones that have substantial improvement, can give you an idea to see, which buildings are most vulnerable. And it does have all those things that were listed there. It helps me when I go into the city of Punta Gorda and their hospital that's historic is a block from Charlotte Harbor. And I don't think the hospital should be a block from Charlotte Harbor, because not only are you going to have to evacuate all the patients, but no one's going to be able to get in or out. You're not going to be able to get ambulances in and out. The poor doctors and nurses that are stuck there, their cars will be flooded. And I think sometimes that risk calculus doesn't always happen. So having L certificates to be analyzed is really important. And then following, this is with City of Annapolis, but Annapolis asked the Army Corps of Engineers to come and do some what we call non-structural assessments for rehab for historic properties. And they actually went around and they filled this form out that you can see on the right. It's hard to see, that's an L certificate. But I watched the Army Corps do this in Annapolis when I was there. They walked around with a backpack that had a GPS on it. And they literally went and they put their post with the backpack and they said, this is the lowest adjacent grade. This is the finished first floor opening. And they did, I think, a couple hundred buildings in about a 3-day period in Annapolis. And it was really neat to have these people boots on the ground. Army Corps paid for it. And we got this really great survey of understanding where our vulnerabilities were. So work with your federal partners. Sometimes if they're in town surveying, they're happy to help with that. This is a really interesting way of surveying too. University of Florida and my friend Marty Hilton, when he was working there in historic preservation, will come in and do a 3D laser survey. This one on the right, this is Cedar Key, which is on the Gulf Coast of Florida. It's probably halfway between the Big Bend area and Tampa is probably the best way to say it. Another historic oyster community with oyster aquaculture. But they put these laser scanners, that's a picture of Marty and one of his students doing it out in the middle. And what it does is it creates some documentation for the future. So if these places are ever lost, they actually have a 3D map. And I've seen it, I've been in the Keeping History Above Water conference in Annapolis, and they had us put our cell phones, turn on their app and put our cell phones in a thing and view it. And it was actually a virtual reality that we could stand there, in a room, and I could kind of walk through the city and see what it looked like. The reason they're doing this UF program, they call it Envision. They started it with Envision Nantucket, but it was just a way of documenting what's there, and it provides it so if it ever disappears in the future, at least we know what was there and we can show it in perpetuity to young people. And the National Center for Preservation, Training and Technology has some really good classes on building and site condition assessments. They work directly with FEMA's Environmental Planning and Historic Preservation Program, but the NCPTTs do very detailed building and site assessments. So it's kind of like the FEMA MAT that I talked about. So it's a probably on the spectrum. FEMA MAT, I would say, is up here. You're sending a lot of engineers out to look at things and building scientists. And then you've got, the volunteers from the community doing the windshield surveys that they're kind of, I think windshield, we're driving around and looking out and taking pictures. They do walk around too. But I think of the NCPT is somewhere in there. It's in the middle, right? It's historic preservation specialists that are looking very specifically at buildings. And you can see it's, they can do a rapid assessment, a 10-minute site evaluation. They have forms and databases. But they even will do, GPS up to 5 locations at a site. GPS as in elevation. I want to know how high those openings are. So it's on the spectrum of, it's not quite the engineering one. It's not quite the windshield. it's to me, it's where the historic preservation meets the engineering and looking at, very detailed historic preservation analysis of sites. Did you all do training on the cultural resource surveyor for the National Park Service? Does anyone do that training this week? I know they were here working on it earlier this week. If you're not familiar, you can Google it or you can ask me for more information afterwards, but there is a cultural resource surveyor. It is an app that's available on your phone or iPad, and it allows, kind of like the one I showed before for engineering. It's like the FEMA MAT one, but it's once again on your phone to look at, you can do it. There's a disaster relief portion of it, but there's also an initial assessment. Did I get all that right, Stephanie? What's that? And archaeology. Thank you. I was like, I know it's disaster relief and initial and archaeology. Yeah. So you can see all the different, specific things where they're looking at additions and chimney and trim and taking different pictures, much more specific to cultural heritage than the previous app that I showed with structural things. And do we provide training on that? Is that right, Stephanie? Do we provide training on CR Surveyor or? Great, thanks. And if you didn't hear that online, they are deploying it to the state SHPO's offices, and training will be provided in the future. All right, and in closing, I'm going to bring Melissa up to talk about funding, but we just want to talk a little bit about the funding that is available. I feel like I've been over talking.
Yep. All right, thank you. I want to be mindful of our time, so we're just going to kind of run through these real quick. But as we mentioned in the beginning, one of our 4 takeaways is about funding. Both funding surveys and how surveys themselves can bring about funding. So the first one we'll talk about is the National Park Service Disaster Recovery Grants. So those are funds through SHPOs and TIPOs to work on various recovery projects. So Florida, and I'm sure Puerto Rico has used those in the past. Then you have Housing and Urban Development, Community Development Block Grants. They help state and local governments recover from presidentially declared disasters. Then finally, you have the Small Business Administration Disaster Loan Assistance Program. So federal funding through FEMA, you have Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, BRIC grants, hazard mitigation grant programs, post-fire assistance funding to help communities implement hazard mitigation after wildfires, flood mitigation assistance programs, and resilience grants for dam safety and earthquake risk. So we're going to talk next just a little bit about FEMA funding in a tiny bit more detail. And then I was going to kind of just close with that case study that I started with Hurricane Michael in the Big Bend area and those rural areas that didn't have a whole lot of surveys. So preparedness grants, environmental planning, and historic preservation compliance, they're required to consider the effects of its actions on the environment and historic properties to ensure that all funded activities comply with federal regulations. So you can see the buckets here of what those grants can go into. And in 2018, you can see the 5 top mitigation project types were acquisitions, flood control, elevations, which is interesting, utility and infrastructure protection, and safe room and wind shelters. And then to wrap up on what we were talking about in Florida, just with this case study in particular, the Florida Division of Historical Resources actually received funds through FEMA to create surveys of those rural communities. They're kind of in red there, so that in the future there are records of these historic resources to go forward for many preservation projects and good things about that. And also, I was just going to mention that Hurricane Michael was in 2018, and there is still work being done. I'm sure you can all recognize and empathize with this, but there is still work being done through federal FEMA funds to actually make the buildings that were impacted be brought back up to what they were. So recovery work is still ongoing there. So we have federal funds that are going in for that. And then finally, funds through FEMA enabled the Division of Historical Resources in Florida to create, and they're just about to launch here, I think in a month or so, it's going to be a great tool, a comprehensive disaster mitigation plan for the state of Florida. And the consultants who worked on this went to, I think, 12 communities throughout the state, including Fort Myers, Apalachicola, which we saw some pictures of, Jacksonville, St. Augustine, and they heard from the communities there. So they engaged these community engagement principles that we talked about, to learn what was important to them and where they were in terms of understanding of risks. And then this great guide is going to be about this thick, is going to come out. It's going to be free and available through the division's website for everyone. It's going to be a great tool to help prepare and plan and respond to risks in the future. So keep an eye on that. It should be out very soon in Florida, but it is a good example of all of these things we're talking about: community engagement, surveys, and then utilizing what you learn to create plans to make it easier and better to respond to the next disaster. We got my animation. So here's a recap of what we talked about today. Just to remind you, we talked about historic resources and disaster risk assessment surveys. Those were two different kinds of surveys. We talked about the benefit of surveys and assessments. We talked about how to do them, some high-level plans on how to do them, and then resources you could go to learn more about how to do them. And then finally, we talked about funding. And as promised, here are some of those resources we talked about. And this picture is from Port Charlotte, where I grew up. This is, you know, I love horses, so this one really spoke to me. But you talk about rising water and high tides. That was a huge issue in Port Charlotte, which is another place where you're on the Gulf and you have that river coming through as well, the Peace River. So surveys are good. Florida Public Archaeology Network is a great resource because, again, archaeology is a big part of disaster planning and survey work as well. And then the St. Augustine Lighthouse and Maritime Museum Research and Archaeology, there is a link to that. You can Google that. It's on there as well. Finally, Keeping History Above Water is a great resource. If you're able to go to that conference, it's a wonderful place to learn whether it's together a cultural resource hazard mitigation plan, the nation's first FEMA approved cultural resource-based mitigation plan. So do you want me to do the takeaways since I'm here? Okay. So Angela likes to take action. So here's our 4 takeaways. Cultural resources should be documented in case of emergency, just as your insurance company advises you to provide pre-event and post-event photos of your car and house. And photos are very important. I'm sure you all know that, but just to stress, a picture does tell 1,000 stories. Ask the experts for help. And I just wanted to repeat something that Angela said that I really think is so important, and I should have said in my communications slides. Historic preservationists use too many acronyms. FEMA uses acronyms. The Division of Historical Resources uses acronyms. I'm not calling anybody out, but there is a lot of acronyms. So if you have any questions, please do raise your hand and ask, because we don't want to have any barriers to our communication and being able to connect with each other. Train people in your community to help. I love getting the volunteers involved. I think it's a wonderful thing to do. And apply for funding for surveys, both pre and post event.